There is a clay tablet in the British Museum that a man dug out of a burning library more than 2,600 years ago, and that almost 3,000 years later caused a Victorian translator to stand up in the middle of a room full of scholars, start tearing off his clothes in front of everyone, and announce that he had just found proof that the most famous story in the Bible was not original. What happened after that moment is even stranger than the moment itself. Because when that same man went back into the desert to look for the missing piece of the story, he found it. And 140 years later, another tablet, sitting for decades in the private collection of a man who did not even know what he had, ended up confirming details of the story that no one expected to be true. This is the story of the Sumerian tablet the Bible couldn't hide, and the discovery that, centuries later, ended up confirming it. To understand why this tablet matters so much, we have to go back to 1849, when a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was digging through the ruins of Nineveh in the north of what is now Iraq. Layard was not looking for religious texts. He was looking for the remains of an empire, the Assyrian Empire, which for centuries had been described almost exclusively through the Bible and through Greek sources. What he found was something even he did not expect. Under layers of sand and rubble, his team unearthed the remains of an entire library. It was the personal library of King Ashurbanipal, one of the last great rulers of Assyria, a man who, unlike most kings of his era, could actually read and write, and who had ordered his scribes to travel across the oldest cities of Mesopotamia, copying every significant text they could find. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the library burned. But the fire, instead of destroying the clay tablets, hardened them, turned them almost into pottery. And so, scorched but intact, they lay buried for nearly 25 centuries, waiting for someone to dig them up. The problem was that nobody could read them. Cuneiform writing had been dead for more than 2,000 years, and when the crates full of tablets arrived at the British Museum in London, they became a puzzle with no instructions. An entire generation of linguists dedicated themselves to trying to crack the code, comparing fragments, searching for patterns, trying to reconstruct a language nobody had spoken since before the founding of Rome. And among those fragments there was something even more baffling. Not all the tablets were written in the same language. There was Assyrian, there was Akkadian, and beneath those layers, in the oldest stratum of all, there was a language unlike anything else known on Earth. It was Sumerian, the language of the first urban civilization in human history, a civilization that had invented writing, the wheel, the first known legal code, and that had then vanished so completely that the rest of the world forgot it had ever existed. It was in the middle of that decoding work that the central figure of this story enters. His name was George Smith, and he was not a university academic. He was a banknote engraver who had taught himself cuneiform by reading tablets in his spare time, and who ended up working at the British Museum because of his obsession with those texts. In 1872, while patiently going through a stack of fragments, Smith came across one that stopped him cold. The tablet described a great flood sent by the gods. It described a man chosen to build an enormous vessel. It described animals brought aboard 2 by 2. It described a bird released to search for dry land. Smith was reading, in Mesopotamian clay written more than 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was compiled, the story of the flood and the ark. According to his own later account, he was so shaken that he began pacing back and forth across the room, and at some point, unable to contain himself, started taking off his clothes in front of his colleagues. It was not theatrical exaggeration. It was the reaction of a man who had just understood that he was holding something that would change the way the world understood the Bible. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because what Smith had was not the complete account. The tablet was damaged. Crucial lines were missing, whole fragments that had either been lost or remained buried in Nineveh. Smith presented his find publicly in December 1872. Before an audience that included some of the most powerful men in England, among them Prime Minister William Gladstone himself. The news spread fast, and with it came an uncomfortable question for Victorian society. If the flood story already existed in Mesopotamia before the people of Israel even existed, what did that mean for the idea that the Bible was a unique and original revelation? The Daily Telegraph, sensing a story that would sell thousands of copies, did something that today would sound almost like science fiction. It offered to fund an expedition so Smith could return to Nineveh, to the very same ruins the original tablets had come from, with an almost impossible goal. Find the exact fragment missing from the story, somewhere inside a mound of rubble the size of a hill, in a country on the other side of the world, with no map indicating where to even begin looking. What happened next is one of the most cited, and least believable if it weren't completely true, episodes in the history of archaeology. Smith arrived in Nineveh, began digging at the original site, and within days, almost as if the desert had been waiting for exactly that, found a tablet fragment that fit the flood narrative. It was not just any fragment. It contained precisely part of the missing lines. The odds of this happening by pure chance were vanishingly small, and to this day it remains one of the most talked about strokes of luck in the history of Near Eastern archaeology. With that piece, the story began to come together, and what emerged is what we know today as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically Tablet 11, where a man named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah are not vague or coincidental. They are specific, and that is precisely what makes this so uncomfortable for certain traditional readings of the Bible. In both accounts, a god warns a single righteous man of an approaching catastrophe. In both accounts, that man receives precise instructions to build a vessel capable of surviving the flood. In both accounts, he is ordered to bring aboard the seed of every form of life, including animals. In both accounts, the vessel comes to rest on top of a mountain once the waters recede. And in both accounts, the survivor releases birds, one after another, to determine whether dry land already exists to return to. In the Mesopotamian version, it is a raven and a dove. In Genesis, it is a dove and a raven, in a slightly different order, but with the exact same narrative function. These are not details that two cultures separated by continents would invent independently. They are evidence that a shared tradition existed, one far older than either of the two texts we know today. But to understand where that tradition really comes from, we have to go back even further than Gilgamesh, because the Epic of Gilgamesh itself is not the original source of the flood story. It is a compilation, written and rewritten over centuries, that absorbed a much older account. That account appears independently in another Sumerian text known as the Atrahasis, which dates to around 1700 BC, several centuries before the versions of Gilgamesh we know today were compiled, and which itself appears to draw on even older oral traditions. In the Atrahasis, the motive for the flood is not even a moral punishment like in the biblical version. The gods grow tired because humanity makes too much noise and won't let them sleep. It is a detail that sounds almost comical compared to the theological weight of the Genesis account, but it reveals something important. The flood story, in its oldest known form, was not born as a moral lesson about sin. It was born as a human attempt to explain a real catastrophic event, most likely a devastating flood on the alluvial plain of Mesopotamia. And over time, that explanation acquired different religious and moral layers depending on the culture that inherited it. This brings us to the question that made Victorian society so uncomfortable in 1872 and that still generates debate today. If the Bible took, adapted, or inherited this story from a much older Mesopotamian tradition, what does that mean for the idea that the Genesis account was a direct and original revelation? The answer from scholars of that era, and largely the academic answer today, is that this does not invalidate the religious or moral meaning the biblical text ultimately carries, but it does demonstrate fairly clearly that the authors of Genesis were working within a literary and cultural tradition that already existed centuries earlier in the region, a tradition they reinterpreted according to their own theology. It is a subtle but crucial distinction. The Bible did not copy the story word for word. It reshaped it completely, put it in service of a different idea about a single God and a moral covenant. But the narrative structure, the concrete details like the bird sent out to scout or the vessel resting on a mountain, those come from much earlier, and that becomes undeniable once you place the Nineveh tablet next to the text of Genesis. For more than a century, that was essentially the whole story. An extraordinary discovery in the 19th century, an uncomfortable theological debate, and then silence, while the Gilgamesh tablet became a museum piece studied almost exclusively by specialists in Assyriology. But in 2009, something happened that very few people outside academic circles know about, and that is the reason this story is still relevant today, almost 150 years after Smith's original discovery. A man brought a tablet to the British Museum that he had inherited from his father, a British veteran who had brought it back from the Middle East after the Second World War without really knowing what it was. The man simply wanted someone to tell him whether it had any value. The tablet ended up in the hands of Irving Finkel, one of the leading cuneiform experts at the British Museum, a specialist who had spent decades working with Sumerian and Akkadian texts. What Finkel found when he translated that tablet, known today informally as the Ark Tablet, was another version of the flood story, but with a level of technical detail no earlier version had shown so clearly. The tablet gives precise instructions for building the vessel, and this is where the discovery becomes genuinely surprising. Unlike the traditional rectangular, boat-shaped image most of us carry in our heads thanks to centuries of religious art, this tablet describes a circular vessel, a kind of giant coracle, a round raft made of woven plant fiber rope and coated with a thick layer of bitumen for waterproofing. The tablet even gives a specific measurement for the surface area of the circular base, large enough, according to calculations Finkel later published, to hold a considerable number of animals and supplies. And just as in the biblical account, it specifies that the animals were to board in pairs. Finkel published his findings in 2014 in a book titled The Ark Before Noah. And what made this discovery so significant is not that it contradicted the story Smith had found a century and a half earlier, but that it confirmed and enriched it from a completely different angle. It was an independent Mesopotamian tradition, with its own origin and its own line of transmission, that nevertheless matched the central structural elements: the divine warning, the chosen man, the vessel built according to precise instructions, the animals in pairs, the flood as a purifying event. The existence of this second tablet, found completely by accident in the home of a British family who did not even know what they had, demonstrated something that many historians had suspected, but until then could not prove so clearly: that the flood story was not a single account copied once and repeated unchanged. It was a living tradition, circulating in multiple versions, written and rewritten by different scribes across different eras, all descended from a common source far older than any of the texts we still have today. What is fascinating about this second discovery is also what it says about how many pieces of this story keep turning up even now, long after the academic world assumed everything relevant on the subject was already known. The Ark Tablet sat unidentified for decades, passed down within a family that treated it as a curious object brought back from the war. Nobody knew it contained technical information about Mesopotamian shipbuilding from almost 4,000 years ago. And this raises an uncomfortable question that Assyriologists themselves openly acknowledge. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets are scattered across museums, private collections, and archaeological storerooms around the world, and only a fraction of them has ever been translated and studied in depth. Every so often, as happened with the Ark Tablet in 2009, a fragment turns up that was lost, mislabeled, or simply ignored, and it ends up changing or enriching what we know about one of the foundational texts of civilization. What makes this story different from other sensational narratives about ancient tablets is precisely that nothing here needs to be exaggerated. The facts, exactly as they happened, are already extraordinary on their own. A self-taught banknote engraver becomes the man who deciphers the Mesopotamian precursor to the biblical flood story. An expedition funded by a newspaper manages, against all reasonable odds, to find the exact missing fragment amid the ruins of a city destroyed more than 2,000 years earlier. And a century and a half later, a tablet forgotten in a family drawer turns out to contain the most detailed engineering instructions ever found for building an ark according to Mesopotamian tradition, confirming from a completely unexpected angle the very same story Smith had unearthed in 1872. So what does all of this actually confirm? It does not confirm, and no serious specialist suggests, that the biblical flood happened exactly as described in Genesis, or that it was a literal global event. What it confirms, with a solidity rarely found in the study of ancient texts, is that humanity had been telling and retelling this same central story long before the people of Israel existed, long before the text we now call the Bible existed. It confirms that behind the Genesis account there is a real literary genealogy, documented in clay, verifiable, stretching back thousands of years into Mesopotamia. And it also confirms something more unsettling for anyone who believes we already know everything there is to know about ancient texts.